The golden glow of the city lights reflected off the sleek glass windows of the limousine as it pulled up to Amaretto, the newest and most exclusive restaurant in town. Lincoln Davis adjusted his cufflinks, the subtle flash of his platinum watch catching the soft interior light. Beside him, Ruth sat poised and elegant, her sequin dress sparkling with every turn of her wrist. She was everything the evening demanded, polished, glamorous, and exuding the same air of affluence that surrounded him. "Do you think they'll have truffle risotto?" Ruth asked, her tone casual but tinged with excitement. "I've been craving it all week." Lincoln smiled, his gaze lingering on her radiant face. "If they don't, I'll make sure they do. Tonight's about celebrating. Nothing's off the table." They stepped out of the limousine, greeted by the cool night air and the soft hum of the city. Amaretto stood like a jewel amidst the skyline, its floor-to-ceiling windows revealing glimpses of the opulence inside. The maitre d' welcomed them with a practiced smile, leading them to a table draped in crisp white linens, perfectly positioned with a panoramic view of the city below. The room buzzed with quiet sophistication. Soft music floated in the background as waiters glided between tables, their movements graceful and unobtrusive. Ruth leaned in, her eyes sparkling. "You always know how to pick them," she whispered, her fingers brushing against his hand. Lincoln allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Tonight wasn't just about the product launch. It was about reminding himself, and everyone else, that he was at the top of his game. Success, after all, was best celebrated with the right company and an impeccable setting. Just as they were settling in, Lincoln's gaze drifted across the room, and his world stopped. His heart skipped a beat, the air around him suddenly heavy. Across the room, moving gracefully between tables, was a woman he thought he'd never see again. Harper. Her hair, once so familiar, was pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore the black blouse and apron of the waitstaff, blending into the elegant ambience of the restaurant. But even in that simple uniform, she radiated a quiet beauty that took his breath away. Then he saw it, the subtle curve of her stomach, unmistakable and hauntingly real. She was pregnant. Lincoln's mind spun, memories crashing over him like waves. Harper laughing on their honeymoon, tears in her eyes the night they admitted they couldn't make it work, the look of betrayal when he chose his career over their marriage. His throat tightened. She looked different, tired, perhaps even fragile, but there was a glow about her that he couldn't deny. A glow that filled him with questions he wasn't ready to face. "Lincoln?" Ruth's voice cut through his haze. "Are you all right?" He tore his gaze away, his heart pounding. "Yeah. I'm fine. Just thought I saw someone I knew." But nothing was fine. Not when his past had just walked into the room, carrying a future he knew nothing about. The golden glow of the chandeliers bathed the restaurant in an ethereal light, casting soft shadows that danced on the polished marble floor. Lincoln Davis tried to focus on the conversation at his table, but his mind was miles away, his gaze continuously drawn back to her, Harper. She moved gracefully between tables, her posture upright, her steps measured and purposeful. Yet, there was a subtle weariness about her, visible only to someone who once knew her intimately. Her hair was pulled back neatly, revealing a face that was both familiar and heartbreakingly different. Her eyes, once filled with laughter and dreams, now carried shadows beneath them, faint traces of exhaustion hidden behind practiced smiles. But it was the curve of her stomach that haunted him the most. A delicate swell, undeniable and profoundly real. The image of Harper, pregnant and working as a waitress, felt surreal. 100 questions spun in his mind. Who was the father? How long had she been like this? Why was she working here? Lincoln's chest tightened, guilt seeping through his polished demeanor. How long had it been since they'd spoken? A year? Longer? He had walked away, convincing himself it was for the best. They wanted different things. He craved power, success, and she wanted something simpler. Something he couldn't give her. Lincoln? Ruth's voice pulled him back. She was looking at him, her eyes curious but gentle. You seem distracted tonight. He forced a smile, brushing away the turmoil inside. Just thinking about work, he lied, lifting his glass of sparkling water to his lips. The product launch is taking more out of me than I thought. Ruth nodded sympathetically, her hand finding his across the table. You work too hard. You deserve a break. We deserve a break. How about the Maldives next month? Lincoln barely heard her. His attention flickered back to Harper, who was now attending to a nearby table, her voice polite and professional. She didn't look his way, her focus entirely on her work. A faint blush colored her cheeks as she carefully balanced plates, her movements calculated, cautious, protecting the life growing inside her. Memories flooded back unbidden. Late nights laughing in their tiny apartment, dancing to old records in their living room, whispered dreams of a future that now seemed like echoes of a life he barely remembered. How had it all gone so wrong? He remembered the day they decided to end it. The argument had been brutal, words thrown like weapons. Harper had begged him to be present, to put their relationship first, to choose her over his career, just once. But Lincoln had been relentless, driven by ambition, unable to understand why she couldn't see his vision of success. I don't need your money, Lincoln, she had said, her voice breaking. I need you. But he wasn't there, not really. And when he chose his company's expansion over their anniversary, she finally gave up. She had packed her things and walked out of his life, leaving behind an emptiness he didn't know how to fill. And now she was here, carrying a child that could be his. The thought hit him like a punch to the gut. Could it really be? Had she moved on so quickly, or was this the consequence of their last night together? His heart pounded as the possibility sank in. If that child was his, how could she keep it a secret? How could she do this alone? His thoughts were shattered by a familiar voice. Good evening. Are you ready to order? Lincoln looked up, his breath catching in his throat. Harper stood before them, poised and professional, her eyes carefully avoiding his. Ruth smiled brightly, oblivious to the storm brewing between them. I'll have the truffle risotto, and for you, Lincoln? He couldn't speak. His gaze was locked on Harper, on the subtle tremor in her hands as she wrote down Ruth's order, on the way she avoided his eyes. He tried to find his voice but failed, the words catching in his throat. Finally, he managed, just water. For now. Harper nodded, her expression unwavering. Of course. Her voice was steady, but as she turned to leave, her eyes met his for a fleeting moment. In that brief connection, Lincoln saw it all, the hurt, the betrayal, the resilience. She was carrying on, surviving without him, without his support. And for the first time, he wondered if she was better off because of it. As she walked away, Lincoln felt his chest tighten, his world shifting beneath him. Everything he thought he knew was unraveling, and there was no escaping the consequences of the choices he had made. The past wasn't just haunting him, it was standing right in front of him, carrying a future he never knew existed. Lincoln's fingers drummed restlessly on the white linen tablecloth, his gaze flickering back to Harper as she moved between tables, her posture rigid, her expression painfully composed. The questions swirling in his mind refused to settle. He had to know. Whose child was she carrying? His chest tightened as he watched her carefully balancing plates, her movements graceful yet cautious. protective. His stomach churned. Was that child his? Was that why she avoided his eyes? Why her face was a mask of professional indifference? "I'll be right back," Lincoln muttered to Ruth, his voice tight. "Need to make a quick call." Before she could respond, he was up, weaving through the sea of tables. His heart pounded as he approached Harper, who was refilling water glasses at a nearby table. Her back was turned, and for a moment, he hesitated, memories flooding back. The way she used to smile at him over morning coffee, the way her laughter could light up an entire room. He cleared his throat, his voice coming out rougher than intended. "Harper." She froze, her shoulders tensing. Slowly, she turned to face him, her expression carefully neutral. But her eyes betrayed her, flashing with a mixture of surprise, anger, and something else, something he couldn't quite place. "Lincoln," she said evenly, her voice firm. "Can I help you with something?" Lincoln's mouth went dry. Up close, the changes were more evident, the faint circles under her eyes, the weariness she couldn't hide, and the undeniable curve of her belly. His heart ached with questions he didn't know how to ask. "We need to talk," he said, his tone more demanding than he intended. Her jaw tightened, her eyes flicking around the room. "I'm working, Lincoln. This isn't the time." "I don't care," he replied, his voice low but urgent. "I need answers." She looked away, her hands clenching around the water pitcher. "There's nothing to say." Lincoln took a step closer, lowering his voice. Is it mine?" The words hung between them, heavy and charged. For a moment, Harper's composure cracked, her eyes widening before she quickly looked down, her fingers tightening around the pitcher's handle. "That's none of your business," she whispered, her voice wavering. "It is if it's my child," Lincoln pressed, his voice trembling. "Harper, you can't just show up like this, like nothing happened. We were married. Her head snapped up, her eyes blazing. "You walked away, Lincoln. You made your choice. Your career, your success, that's what mattered to you." Her voice trembled, a crack appearing in her otherwise flawless facade. "You didn't want this life. You didn't want me." The accusation hit him like a punch to the gut. He opened his mouth to protest, but the words wouldn't come. She was right. He had chosen his ambition over their marriage, over her. And now? "You didn't tell me," he said, his voice breaking. "You didn't think I had a right to know?" Harper's eyes softened, a flicker of pain crossing her face before she looked away. "I didn't think you'd care." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "You walked away without looking back. Why would I think you'd care now?" The weight of her words crushed him, guilt tightening around his chest. He had convinced himself that their breakup was inevitable, that they wanted different things. But the truth was, he had been too focused on himself to see what he was losing. "Harper," his voice was hoarse, his heart aching. "I never meant to hurt you." She laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "Well, congratulations. You did a hell of a job." Lincoln flinched, shame washing over him. He took a step back, his shoulders slumping. I want to help. If that child is mine, I want to be there. I want to do the right thing." Harper's gaze hardened, her chin lifting defiantly. "You think you can just show up now? After all this time?" Her voice shook with anger. "You think I need your money? Your pity? It's not like that." "Then what is it like, Lincoln?" she snapped, her eyes flashing. "You think you can waltz back into my life because you're feeling guilty? Because you suddenly realized you walked away from something that mattered?" He stood there, speechless, her words cutting through him with precision. She was right, he had been selfish, blind to her pain. And now, standing before her, seeing the strength and vulnerability in her eyes, he felt smaller than he ever had before. I want to be there for you, he whispered, his voice cracking. For both of you. If you'll let me. Harper's eyes filled with tears, her mask slipping for just a moment. But she quickly blinked them away, her expression hardening once more. I don't need your help, Lincoln. I'm doing fine on my own. She turned to leave, but his hand shot out, lightly touching her arm. Harper, please. I need to know. Is it mine? She looked down at his hand, then back up at him, her eyes cold and distant. Does it matter? Before he could respond, she pulled away, her posture stiff as she walked back to the kitchen, her head held high. Lincoln stood there, his heart pounding, his world spinning. He had come looking for answers, but all he was left with were more questions, and a regret that cut deeper than he ever thought possible. Lincoln stood motionless, his hands still tingling from where he had touched Harper's arm. Her words echoed in his mind, each one a dagger piercing deeper. Does it matter? Yes. It mattered more than anything. It mattered because if that child was his, then everything he had built, everything he had sacrificed, was incomplete. Hollow. What was the point of all his wealth and success if he had walked away from the one thing that truly mattered? He turned slowly, his gaze following Harper as she disappeared into the kitchen. His heart twisted painfully, the memory of her tear-streaked face the night she left searing through his mind. He had told himself it was for the best, that they wanted different things, but the truth was simpler and uglier. He had been selfish. He had chosen ambition over love. Lincoln? Ruth's voice jolted him back to the present. She stood a few steps away, her brows knitted with worry. Are you okay? You look pale. He forced a smile, struggling to mask the turmoil raging inside him. I'm fine. Just work stuff. Ruth's eyes softened with understanding, and she reached out, gently touching his arm. You need to relax. You've been so tense lately. Let's enjoy tonight, okay? Just you and me. Lincoln nodded, his chest tightening with guilt. Ruth was everything he thought he wanted, beautiful, intelligent, successful. She was his perfect match, his equal. And yet, standing there with her, all he could think about was Harper. About the life they could have had, should have had. He followed Ruth back to their table, his movements robotic, his mind elsewhere. As she talked about their upcoming trip to the Maldives, her excitement palpable, Lincoln's thoughts spiraled into chaos. Could he walk away again? Could he turn his back on Harper and that child if it was his? Ruth laughed, her hand resting on his, her eyes sparkling with affection. I was thinking we could book the overwater villa. Just the two of us, no interruptions. Doesn't that sound perfect? He looked at her, his throat tightening. She was planning a future with him, a future he wasn't sure he could give her anymore. Yeah, sounds perfect, he lied, his voice hollow. The evening dragged on, every moment stretching painfully as Lincoln fought to keep his composure. But his eyes kept drifting back to the kitchen, his heart pounding every time the door swung open. He was waiting for her, needing to see her one more time. His chance came when Harper emerged, her shoulders tense, her eyes fixed firmly on the ground. She moved quickly, clearing tables with practiced efficiency, never once looking his way. It was deliberate, calculated. She was avoiding him, and it hurt more than he cared to admit. Ruth excused herself to the restroom, and Lincoln seized the opportunity. He rose swiftly, weaving through the tables, his heart hammering as he closed the distance between them. Harper, wait. She She stiffened but didn't turn around. "I'm working, Lincoln. Leave me alone." "I can't. Not until you answer me." "Is it mine?" She went rigid, her hands tightening around the tray she was holding. "I told you, it's none of your business." "It is my business if I'm the father," he countered, his voice low and strained. "I have a right to know." She spun around, her eyes blazing with anger. "You have a right." She laughed bitterly, the sound sharp and cutting. "You forfeited that right when you chose your career over me. Over us." Lincoln flinched, shame washing over him. "I know. I made mistakes. But this, if it's my child, I want to be there. I want to do the right thing." Harper's expression softened, pain flickering in her eyes before she looked away. "You always do this, show up when it's convenient for you. You left, Lincoln. You didn't look back. Why are you here now?" "Because I didn't know," he said, his voice cracking. "I didn't know you were pregnant. I didn't know." "You didn't care," she interrupted, her voice trembling. "I waited, Lincoln. I waited for you to come back, to fight for us. But you never did. You moved on. So did I." The words hit him like a slap, leaving him speechless. She was right. He had walked away, convincing himself it was for the best. But it wasn't. It never was. Harper's shoulders slumped, exhaustion seeping into her posture. "I don't need you. I don't need your money, your pity, or your guilt. I've been doing fine on my own, and I'll keep doing fine without you." Lincoln's chest tightened, panic surging through him. "Please, don't shut me out. I can't change the past, but I can be here now. For you, and the baby." Harper's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but she quickly blinked them away, her jaw tightening. "You don't get to play hero, Lincoln. Not this time." She turned sharply, walking away without looking back. Lincoln watched her go, his heart shattering with every step she took. He had lost her once, and now he was losing her again, this time with more at stake than ever before. He stood there long after she was gone, his world crumbling around him. He had always believed that success meant power, wealth, and influence. But standing there, alone and broken, Lincoln realized that none of it mattered if he had no one to share it with. His empire felt empty, his victories hollow. Because somewhere along the way, he had lost the one thing that truly mattered, love. And now, he was paying the price for his choices, his ambition, his pride. The past had come back to haunt him, carrying the future he never knew existed. And this time, he couldn't run away. This time, he had to face it, no matter how painful it would be. Lincoln stood outside the restaurant, the cold night air biting at his skin. The city lights glittered around him, mocking his misery with their brilliance. Inside, Ruth waited, unaware of the storm raging within him. Unaware that her perfect evening was falling apart piece by piece. He ran a hand through his hair, his mind spinning. What was he supposed to do? Everything he thought he wanted, success, wealth, status, felt meaningless now. Harper's face haunted him, her pain etched into his memory. She was stronger than he remembered, fiercer. And she was right, he had walked away. But did that mean he had to stay away? His phone buzzed, snapping him from his thoughts. It was a message from Ruth. "Everything okay? Should I call the car?" Lincoln's fingers hovered over the screen. He looked back through the restaurant window, catching a glimpse of Ruth laughing with a waiter, her smile bright and genuine. She deserved better than this, better than him standing outside, tormented by a past he couldn't let go of. He took a deep breath, his decision solidifying. No more running. No more hiding. It was time to face the consequences of his choices, to make things right, whatever that meant. Lincoln slipped back inside, his steps heavy as he approached their table. Ruth's smile faltered when she saw his expression, her eyes clouding with concern. "Lincoln? What's wrong?" He sank into the chair, his shoulders sagging. "We need to talk." Ruth's face fell, her hand instinctively clutching her wine glass. "That sounds serious." "It is," he admitted, his voice low. I saw someone tonight. Someone from my past." Her brow furrowed. "Who?" Lincoln hesitated, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. But he owed her honesty. "My ex-wife. Harper." Ruth's eyes widened, her lips parting in shock. "She's here? Now?" He nodded, his throat tightening. "She's working here. And she's pregnant." The silence that followed was suffocating. Ruth's face paled, her fingers trembling as she set the glass down. "You think it's yours?" It wasn't a question. "I don't know," Lincoln whispered, his voice cracking. "But I need to find out. I need to know if I have a child out there. I can't just walk away." Ruth looked away, blinking rapidly. Her shoulders tensed, her jaw tightening. "So, what does that mean, for us?" Lincoln felt his heart break, guilt crashing over him. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice hollow. "I just know that I can't ignore this. Not again." Tears glistened in Ruth's eyes, but she quickly wiped them away, her expression hardening. "I deserve better than this, Lincoln. I deserve someone who chooses me. Only me." "I know," he whispered, his chest aching. "You deserve everything. But I can't lie to you, or myself. I have to do the right thing." Ruth looked at him, her gaze piercing. "I hope you find what you're looking for." Her voice cracked, but she stood tall, her dignity unshaken. "Goodbye, Lincoln." She walked away, her head held high, leaving him alone at the table, surrounded by the shattered remains of his perfect life. Lincoln watched her leave, a deep sadness settling over him. He had loved her, still did, in a way. But the truth was painfully clear. His heart had never fully let go of Harper. And now, he had to face the consequences. 3 days later, Lincoln stood outside a small, modest apartment building, his heart pounding in his chest. He had tracked down Harper's address, torn between guilt and determination. He owed her the truth, and an apology. His hand shook as he knocked on the door. It swung open, and there she was, her eyes widening in surprise. "Lincoln? What are you doing here?" He swallowed, his throat tight. "I came to talk. To apologize. And to ask you the question you didn't answer." Her face hardened, her eyes guarded. "You're not going to let this go, are you?" "No," he admitted, his voice firm. "I walked away once. I'm not doing it again." Harper hesitated, her gaze dropping to her belly, now more visible under the loose sweater she wore. She took a deep breath, stepping back. "Come in." The apartment was small but cozy, filled with soft light and warmth. Lincoln's heart twisted as he noticed the baby clothes folded neatly on a chair, the crib half assembled in the corner. This was real. She sat on the couch, her posture tense. "What do you want, Lincoln?" He sat across from her, his hands clasped tightly. "I want to do the right thing. I want to be there for you, and the baby. If you'll let me." Harper's eyes softened, her defenses crumbling. "Why now? Why do you care now?" Lincoln's shoulders slumped, shame washing over him. Because I was a coward. I was selfish. I convinced myself that my career was the most important thing, and I lost you. But this baby, if it's mine, then that changes everything. Her eyes glistened with tears, and she looked away. I didn't want you to feel trapped. I didn't want to force you into something you didn't want. Lincoln moved closer, his voice trembling. You didn't force me into anything. I made my choices, and I have to live with them. But I won't run away from this. Not again. Harper wiped her eyes, her expression softening. I spent so long being angry at you. But the truth is, I still loved you. Even after everything. His heart clenched, hope flickering in his chest. Do you think we could try again? Not just for the baby, but for us? She looked at him, vulnerability shining in her gaze. I don't know. I don't want to get hurt again. I won't hurt you, Lincoln vowed, his voice steady. I'll prove it to you. Every day. For as long as it takes. A tear slipped down her cheek, and she nodded, her walls finally breaking. Okay, but you have to mean it this time. I do, he whispered, his heart full. I promise. He reached out, his hand trembling as he placed it gently on her belly. Harper's fingers covered his, their touch warm and familiar. For the first time in years, Lincoln felt whole. Together, they sat in the soft light of the room, the past finally letting go, making way for a future they would face together. The first light of dawn filtered through the window, bathing the room in a soft, golden glow. Lincoln sat in the worn armchair by the window, his gaze fixed on the crib in the corner. Tiny fingers curled into a fist, a gentle sigh escaping the sleeping infant. His son. His son. Emotion welled up in Lincoln's chest, overwhelming and raw. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his fingers trembling as he ran them through his hair. How had he almost missed this? How had he almost walked away again? The journey to this moment had been long and painful, filled with guilt and regret. But it had also been one of healing and redemption. A chance to rewrite his story, to be the man, the father, and the partner he should have been all along. A soft rustle broke his thoughts, and he looked up to see Harper standing in the doorway, her hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes soft and warm. She watched him in silence, a small smile playing at her lips. You're up early. Lincoln glanced back at the crib, his heart swelling. I couldn't sleep. Harper crossed the room, her steps quiet, almost hesitant. She stopped beside him, her gaze drifting to the baby, her face softening with love. He looks like you. Lincoln's breath caught, his chest tightening. He's perfect. Harper looked at him then, her eyes shining with tears. You really came back. You really stayed. Her voice wavered, raw and vulnerable. I was so afraid you wouldn't. Lincoln stood, his heart aching as he faced her. I was afraid too. Afraid I'd fail you again. Afraid I wouldn't know how to do this, how to be a father. Her hand reached out, fingers brushing his, their touch tentative but warm. You're doing just fine. He looked down at their intertwined hands, a lump forming in his throat. I never meant to hurt you, Harper. I was selfish, blinded by ambition. I lost sight of what truly mattered. I lost sight of you. Her lips trembled, a tear slipping down her cheek. You broke me, Lincoln. You left me feeling unwanted, unloved. Her voice cracked, her pain raw and exposed. I didn't know how to move on. But I had to, for him. Her eyes flicked to the crib, her resolve strengthening. I had to be strong because you weren't there. The weight of her words crushed him, shame burning through him. I can't change the past, but I can spend the rest of my life making it up to you. To both of you. Harper's eyes softened, her fingers tightening around his. I don't need you to be perfect. I just need you to be here. To stay. Lincoln's heart shattered, the last remnants of his pride and fear crumbling away. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. Not this time. Her shoulders relaxed, relief flooding her face. Then we can start over, together. His chest ached with hope, his heart pounding as he pulled her into his arms. She fit perfectly against him, just like she always had. His past, his present, and his future were all here, in this moment, with her. They stood there in the soft morning light, holding each other, their broken pieces slowly mending, their hearts finding their way back to each other. 6 months later. The laughter of children echoed through the park, mingling with the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. Lincoln stood by the playground, his gaze locked on the tiny figure toddling across the grass, his steps wobbly but determined. His son's face lit up with pure joy, his chubby arms outstretched as he stumbled forward, giggling with each step. Lincoln's heart swelled, his chest tight with love so fierce it took his breath away. This was everything. Everything he never knew he needed. Everything he almost lost. A hand slipped into his, warm and familiar. Harper stood beside him, her eyes bright as she watched their son, her smile radiant. He's getting better at walking. Lincoln nodded, his throat tightening. He's incredible. Harper leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder. You're pretty incredible too. He turned to look at her, his heart aching with gratitude. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you, for giving me a second chance. Her eyes softened, a playful glint shining through. You earned it. You fought for it. Lincoln's fingers tightened around hers. I'll keep fighting. Every day. For you. For him. For us. She looked up at him, her smile warm and tender. I believe you. Lincoln's heart soared, hope filling every corner of his soul. They stood there, watching their son explore the world with wonder and laughter, a world they had rebuilt together. Life is full of second chances, but they're never guaranteed. It takes courage to face the past, to admit mistakes, and to fight for the people who matter most. Lincoln had almost lost everything because of his pride, his ambition, and his fear. But he found his way back because he chose to let go of his ego and embrace his vulnerability. Success isn't measured by wealth, power, or status. It's measured by love, by the relationships we build, and by the lives we touch. Lincoln learned that his empire meant nothing without someone to share it with. He learned that love is worth fighting for, even when it's hard, even when it's messy. He learned that being a father isn't about perfection, it's about presence, about showing up, about staying. As the sun set over the park, bathing the world in a golden glow, Lincoln finally understood that he was richer than he had ever been. Not because of his wealth or his success, but because of the love he had found, love that had been waiting for him all along. He looked at Harper, his heart full, his soul at peace. I love you, he whispered, his voice raw and honest. She smiled, her eyes shining with tears. I love you too. Together, they watched their son chase butterflies across the grass, his laughter ringing out like music. Their past was behind them, their future unwritten. But one thing was certain, they would face it together, hand in hand, heart to heart. Because love was worth it. Because family was worth it. And finally, Lincoln knew exactly where he belonged. This story isn't just about love lost and found, it's about second chances, redemption, and the courage to fight for what truly matters. What would you have done if you were in Lincoln's shoes? Would you have fought for a love you almost lost? Or would you have walked away, believing it was too late? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective on Lincoln and Harper's journey. If you enjoyed this emotional tale of love, forgiveness, and redemption, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more heart-touching stories. Stay tuned for more.